to tell you, I will try to share with
las
you
cosas que yo sé sobre este tema
what
de
I
comercio y
know
medio
about
ambiente en
trade
América
and
Latina,
environment in Latin America.
que bueno, es un tema que vengo siguiendo hace bastante y
This is a
la
topic in
charla
which
la
I've
voy a
been
repartir en
involved
cuatro
in
partes, digamos.
for a long time,
Por
and I'm
un
going
lado,
to
el tema de
divide this
cómo es
presentation in four parts.
la
First,
complejidad que tiene el
we're
régimen
going
de la
to
regulación del
touch
cambio
upon the
climático,
complexity of
dentro de
the
del cual,
regime
por
of the
supuesto, que
schemes
entra el
regarding
tema
climate
comercial,
change, and then we're going to
los
jump into
instrumentos
trade.
que hay
Number
de
two,
regulaciones ambientales y cómo interactúan con
environmental
los
regulation
comerciales. Después
instruments,
vamos a hablar un poquito
regulations
sobre los
in
acuerdos
international
comerciales
agreements.
regionales
Number
y su
three,
relación con el cambio
environmental
climático.
provisions
Y después al
in
final les voy a
RTAs
hablar
and
sobre un tema que
environmental
vengo
clauses.
trabajando
And
en
number
estos
four
últimos
is
tiempos,
the
que
last
son
topic I've
los impactos de
been
las
doing research
acciones
in, which is the
unilaterales
impact of
comerciales y
unilateral
en
actions,
particular de los
in
ajustes de carbono
particular
en frontera
the
y de la prohibición de
carbon
importación de bienes que no pueden
frontier
probar que fueron
adjustments
producidos
and their
sin
impact in Latin
deforestar.
America,
Son
and
dos regulaciones
how
comerciales
prohibitions of
relacionadas al
imports
tema
or banning
climático de
imports
la
of
Unión
goods that are
Europea,
not
pero que
were produced
Estados Unidos ya
without
tiene
deforestation.
proyectos de ley
Let me tell
para
you that the
ciudadanos
United States
similares
has
y hay otros países
similar
que también las están
bills,
pensando.
and there are several
Entonces yo un
countries
poco
which
lo
are
que quiero
thinking
es
about this
mostrarles la
new
complejidad de la
scenario. So
regulación
I'm going
climática,
to show you the
ver que lo
complexity of
comercial se
climate,
interrelaciona
the
con esas
climate scene,
regulaciones
how
climáticas
that is
y
connected
ver
to trade, and how
cómo es esa interrelación y
and what the
hablar
interrelationship
entonces
is.
de los tres niveles, o sea,
We are
cómo
going
son
to
las
speak about
regulaciones
the three
internacionales,
levels,
después
international
las regulaciones
regulations,
regionales, y por
regional
eso vamos a ver los acuerdos
regulations.
comerciales
That's why we're
regionales,
going
y
to
después al
touch
final
upon
las
regional
acciones
agreements and then
unilaterales.
unilateral
Entonces van a ver que todo
regulations.
va a ser
So
muy
you'll
colorido.
see that there are going to
Entonces
be a lot
vamos
of
a seguir
colors
estos
in my
mismos colores que
presentation,
los van a
which
poder
I'm
convivir,
going to
cosa que vean
choose
cómo vamos
to
avanzando a lo
orient
largo
you
de la charla.
along the
Entonces,
presentation.
por un lado, primero decirles que el
First,
régimen del cambio climático
let
es
me tell you that
como
this
bien dijeron en un artículo
regime,
del 2011
as it was
de
said
Joan
in
Victor, es un
2011
régimen
by Kieran
complejo.
Victor,
¿Qué
is a
quiere decir?
complex
Que coexisten las regulaciones
regime because there is
internacionales
a
con
coexistence of
regulaciones
international
nacionales y
regulations
regionales que
together with
también
regional
supranacionales,
and
y dentro de toda
domestic
esa mezcla
regulations. And
también hay cosas que son de ciudades, del
you
sector
have to
privado.
add also
Entonces,
the
realmente
city
es
ingredients, the
bastante
private sector
complejo cómo
ingredients,
es que está
which results
organizado el
in a
régimen
rather
referido al
complex
cambio climático,
regime
que es un problema
dealing
que, como
with
todos
climate
ustedes
change.
saben,
As
es
you
un
know,
problema global.
climate change is a
Entonces, ¿qué
global
pasa?
problem.
En las negociaciones ambientales
In
internacionales no hay
international
una prioridad
environmental negotiations,
supranacional.
there is
No hay
not
alguien
a
que pueda
single
decir vos hace esto, vos hace esto.
supranational authority
Entonces, que
above the
tanto en la
states.
Convención de Cambio Climático como en el
In the
Acuerdo de París, lo que está
UNFCCC and the
previsto en la
Paris
sociedad del
Agreement,
acuerdo es
what
tres
is
cosas. Por
what
un lado,
we have is three
financiamiento,
things.
o sea
First,
que hay fondos
financing,
destinados a
so
temas
funds
climáticos
channeled to
previstos
climate
dentro de
change,
estos acuerdos.
which
Por
are
otro lado, la
enshrined
transferencia
in these
de
agreements,
tecnología y por otro
then
lado, el
transfer of technology,
fortalecimiento de
and then
capacidades.
capacity
Todo
building.
eso es como que
All this
sostiene
holds
los acuerdos internacionales sobre
or
cambio
is the
climático.
foundation for
Pero
international
eso
agreements
no es
on
todo. Por
climate
otro
change.
lado
But
están
this
las
is not all
negociaciones
we have to
comerciales que
take into
también
account. We have
ejercen una
to
presión
consider as well
para que los países se
regional
encaminen hacia el cambio
negotiations,
climático.
trade
Y también
negotiations,
puede
rather,
pasar que
trade
en otros
negotiations,
foros
and
internacionales
there are other
influya cuál es la
international
reputación
fora
con respecto a la política
in which
climática
the
de los países.
reputation of the different countries
Entonces,
is exposed.
¿qué son los instrumentos de
Let us
regulación
see the
ambiental? Y los
instruments,
instrumentos de regulación ambiental en
environmental regulation
general
instruments
son de
in
tres
general
tipos:
may
los
be classified in
estándares
three categories:
ambientales y después una
environmental
serie de
standards,
instrumentos
and then
basados en
there is a
incentivos, que son
series of
impuestos verdes y subsidios,
instruments which are based upon
permisos
incentives,
comercializables,
taxes
sistemas de
and
responsabilidad
subsidies,
ya
tradable
real,
permits, le legal liability or liability system and deposits and refunds. For example, let me give you an example. When you buy a bottle of beer, for example, you have to pay for the container and then that is refunded. And third is the different dissemination to communicate information, which deal with the environmental position of the different companies. So these are different ways to regulate environmental affairs. But internationally, there are standards as the common situation. For example, in Rio, there is a commitment to reduce emissions. And it was the first time that the notion of tradable permits were used related to standards, and that appeared resulting from the Kyoto Agreement. So, what is the evolution to see what that chapeau is like? What instruments have been used and what is their evolution? When we started the CMNUCC, the regulations were standard because the convention stated that developed countries committed themselves to stabilize emissions vis- for the year 2000 vis-a-vis 1990. That has to do with quality or quantity rather, with quantity, because we commit ourselves to stabilize quantities of emission. Afterwards, with Kyoto, the regulation instrument was combined with the systems of carbon trade, the joint implementation, the trade of emissions, and what was called the mechanism of clean development. This evolved, and we arrived in Paris, and the commitment there had to do with what each country could do. The commitments are similar to the Kyoto commitments because Paris in Article 6 has trade of emissions in the text of the agreement, and each country commits itself to uh, a reduction, a certain reduction. With Kyoto, if we remember, the agreements were agreed upon. It was a top-down agreement. So they agreed, the countries agreed upon a number of emissions. Whereas in Paris, each country presented its metrics. Some countries refer to their past, some other countries have a tendency to have a trend to reduce emissions, and there are other positions. Metrics, resulting metrics are different, and the mechanism is different. But everything is translated into quantities. Paris, in this sense, is similar to Kyoto because we speak about quantity of emissions with a system of trade of emissions, which is in Article 6. So far, I have presented how the international system works. Nowadays, each country has different commitments assumed voluntarily, and then we can have a look at markets included in Article 6, which are being defined, but there is nobody who can make a country or oblige a country to do something because each country is sovereign. So how do we support this? We support this with funds, with transfer of technology to fund, to build capacity, but not only with this, because as the system is complex, it has to be supported by other kind of foundations. At
apuntalamientos.
least that is the
Entonces,
aspiration.
uno de esos
One
apuntalamientos,
of
más y
those
más, son
foundations
los acuerdos
are
comerciales
the
regionales.
regional trade agreements.
Entonces, es una realidad que cada
So
vez los acuerdos ambientales regionales cada
RTAs
vez tienen más provisiones ambientales.
uh,
Y eso se ve bien en este
incorporate
gráfico.
environmental
¿Este
provisions
gráfico qué es?
more and more.
Es
And you can see that in
el
this graph.
porcentaje de
This
tratados
shows the
internacionales
percentage of international
comerciales
agreements
que
in relation to
además
trade
de tener cuestiones
that
comerciales tienen otros
they
temas. ¿Está
include
bien?
trade
Entonces,
topics, but
¿cuáles
also
son
other
los temas
topics.
que tienen
So, which
normalmente?
are those
Y algo sobre
additional
terrorismo,
topics?
algo sobre
Maybe
salud, algo sobre
terrorism,
lavado de dinero,
health,
algo
money
sobre drogas,
laundering,
algo sobre
drugs,
derechos humanos,
human rights.
pero de los tratados
But
ratificados
from all
a la
ratified
fecha de este paper,
agreements,
digamos, lo que más tienen nuevo, además de las cuestiones
what the
comerciales,
newest
son las
things that have been
cuestiones ambientales.
incorporated
O sea
are the
que
environmental
uno no se
topics.
asombra ya en
So
un tratado
it's no
comercial
wonder to see
regional
in a
que haya
regional trade
cuestiones
agreement
ambientales, además de las
to
comerciales, porque es
see
lo que más hay.
environmental topics
Y
because they
esto
are
va en la
abundant
misma
there.
línea.
And this goes
Si
along
uno
the same
mira
lines.
cuáles otras
If you
cuestiones,
see
además de las
other
comerciales, hay,
topics
las
aside
que
from
más han ido en
trade are
ascenso son
there,
las ambientales,
you can see that the
mientras que las
environmental topics
otras
are on the
no,
increase,
no, no
whereas the
están
others
particularmente subiendo.
are
¿Está
not
bien?
particularly
Entonces,
increasing.
¿eso qué quiere decir?
So,
Que
what does it mean?
el tema, entre los temas no comerciales, el ambiental
Among
es
the
el más
non
importante.
trade topics, the environmental
Entonces, ¿cómo
topics
se
is the most
incorpora el
important
tema
one.
ambiental a los
So,
distintos acuerdos
how
comerciales?
is the
Y si
environment
ustedes piensan en
incorporated
Unión
into the
Europea-Mercosur,
agreements? If you
un
think about the
acuerdo que
EU
ya más o
Mercosur
menos
is not
hay
approved, but
un
at
draft
least
que,
there's a
uno puede
draft
considerar bastante
that you
completo,
can think
esto
that it is
lo
quite
que es
complete.
un capítulo
This
específico
draft contains a
dedicado a las
specific
cuestiones
chapter
ambientales y sociales.
to environmental
Pero a lo
and
largo de los
social
años
issues,
eso
but
ha ido
along the
cambiando.
years, this has
Primero
been
era
changing.
una declaración
First, it was
general,
just a general
después un capítulo
declaration. After
específico.
that, a specific
Algunos
chapter.
acuerdos, por ejemplo el
Some
NAFTA, tuvo
agreements,
un
like the
documento
NAFTA,
aparte. Y
had
ahora en
a
la Unión
separate document, and
Europea-Mercosur también
today in
hay la
EU
idea de un
Mercosur,
agregado. ¿Está
there's
bien?
this idea going
Entonces,
around
esto
about
es
including
un
an
poco lo que
annex
yo les
or an
vengo diciendo.
attachment.
Antes de
So this is what I'm telling you.
1980,
Before
el tema
1980,
ambiental no estaba
the,
prácticamente en ningún
the
acuerdo.
environment was
Pero
not
después, a
included in
medida que
any
fue pasando
agreement,
el
but
tiempo, cada vez
as
más
time
estuvo
went
metido en
by,
los acuerdos internacionales.
it
Ya
started to
hoy
gain
un montón de
presence
los
or to
acuerdos
have
regionales
presence in
comerciales
many agreements.
tienen el
So
tema
many
ambiental
trade
metido.
agreements
¿Está bien?
today have this
Entonces,
environmental perspective.
esta la voy a pasar. Entonces, ¿qué concluimos de esto? Que el
So, what are
número
the
de provisiones
conclusions? The
ambientales
number of
no hace más que
environmental
crecer dentro de
provisions
los acuerdos
are growing
comerciales
exponentially
regionales. ¿Por
within
qué? Y porque se
RTAs.
trata de
Why?
meter el tema ambiental también como
Because
una cuña
the
a
environment
nivel de
is
esos
kind of a
acuerdos, no
wedge in these
solamente a nivel
agreements, not only
de la regulación de cambio climático
from the
usual.
climate change
Entonces, por eso
regulation
es que
perspective,
cada vez más el tema
but
ambiental se está
also
metiendo en los acuerdos regionales comerciales.
uh,
Entonces,
including
combinando las
this topic
distintas
in the
fuentes, esto que
RTAs.
normalmente
Combining the
se
different
mete,
sources, what
yo lo que
we can see
hice hace un tiempo
is this. I have done this some time
fue
ago.
decir, bueno, miro todos los temas que
I want to
hago
see
una
all the
lista de
topics
lo que
there,
siempre viene en
and
los
I
acuerdos
make a
comerciales
list
regionales.
of the
¿Y qué
common
es lo que,
topics
los
in
10
RTAs,
mandamientos, digamos,
the
de
Ten
lo que
Commandments,
viene en
so to
los acuerdos
speak,
ambientales regionales?
that are
Y yo los
included in the
desafío a
environmental
que
regional
agarren cualquier acuerdo
agreements. So I
comercial
challenge you to
regional
take any
y hagan un
RTA
punteo de lo que viene y van
and
a ver que
make a
de estos
checklist
10
of what's coming,
mandamientos
and you'll
viene
see
la
from
mayoría.
these
¿Y
commandments,
cuáles
10
son esas
commandments,
cosas?
most of them are
Y
going to
la
be included.
aceptación de la
The first one
importancia
is
de cuidar el
accepting that it's
ambiente.
important to
Generalmente eso
care
es
for
una
the
declaración
environment.
que se pone.
This is a
Pero por
declaration
otro lado se
that is
deja
very
que cada
common,
país fije
but
sus
also
propias
each country
metas
can set
ambientales.
its
Pero lo que
own
se dice es que
environmental
no pueden
rules, but they cannot be more lenient than today's rules. You cannot race to the bottom. This means in order for you to draw more trade, you lower environmental requirements. This is expressly included in all the provisions. The agreements say that you can do what you want, but there are limits because you can't make regulations more lenient in terms of the environment in order to foster trade. Point number 3, countries commit to comply with multilateral agreements, the Convention on Biodiversity, the Paris Agreement, then respect for the property rights. And this has to do with intellectual property, referring to transgenic seeds, then promoting trade in green goods and services, and then environmental governance. Citizens must be engaged here in companies as well. They have to try to do as much as possible in terms of environmental measures. And then we have the specific issues. I'm sorry, I'm trying to fix this slide. These specific topics change based on each agreement because it depends on which countries are participating, or which is the topic that raises more concerns. And then information exchange and how to deal with or settle disputes. 100% of the times, you will always see accepting how important it is to care for the environment, not to make lenient rules and the multilateral agreements one has to comply with, the governance and green goods and services, that is always included, and also the specific topics that change based on the agreement. But today, you cannot negotiate an RTA and not finding the environmental perspective here. It's naive to think that this will not happen because it's always there, because it is trying to support the global agreement compliance. That is what is drafted or written in the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. So, an example about how these specific topics change, looking at the EU with Hungary, you see forest, flora and fauna. In Lithuania, fishing and energy. With the Caribbean, tourism and energy. So this is adjusted to the topic or the issue in question in each region. I mean, the regions that are signing or signatory to the agreement. And this is the case for the European Union and the Mercosur. So now we are going to talk about why we see unilateral measures. We are not speaking about global and regional ones, but here I want to discuss that countries unilaterally take trade measures that are related to the environment. So, trade openness with others. There are two possible positive outcomes that having a trade openness with a counterpart have. Trade is a revenue generation engine. Trade has a positive impact for a country's growth.
ser
So
beneficioso para el
trade
ambiente.
will be
¿Por qué?
positive or beneficial to
Porque
the
no es
environment.
que
And why?
si el comercio genera
Because
más
if
ingresos,
trade is a
entonces
revenue generating
a
engine,
mayores ingresos la
then
gente
the more
va a
revenue,
aumentar su demanda por
the
cuestiones
more
ambientales, porque sus
demand
las necesidades básicas,
driven
entre
by
ellas,
environmental
va a
issues
aumentar
because
la
they have
demanda
their
por
basic needs already
energía
satisfied,
limpia,
and so they will
y dentro de
increase
eso el
their
impacto
demand
ambiental, pero
due
también
to
porque un país más rico
non-basic
tiene acceso
needs
a mejores
questions.
tecnologías.
Also,
Entonces,
a rich
esas
country
mejores
has access
tecnologías,
to better
a ver, ¿qué
technologies.
problema tengo? Discúlpenme. Esas mejores tecnologías, ¿ven mi
These
pantalla?
improved technologies, can you see
Sí,
my
se ve
screen?
perfecto, Mariana.
Esas mejores tecnologías
These
hacen que
technologies,
haya más cuidado
or
ambiental.
technologies improvements,
Entonces, esa es
drive
una opción
environmental
que es
care.
positiva.
This is a
O sea,
positive
mayor
option.
apertura comercial, mayor
Higher trade
ingresos,
openness,
mejoras
more
tecnológicas,
revenues or
mayor demanda de
incomes,
los consumidores
technology
por protección
improvements,
ambiental,
higher consumer
se lo
demands
demandan al
for
gobierno, el gobierno
environmental
con
reasons, the
regulaciones y todo bien.
government gets
Pero
involved
también
with
puede
more
pasar que
regulation and
no sea
everything is
así,
fine.
¿está
But
bien?
we can have the
¿Y qué
opposite
puede pasar?
scenario.
Y puede pasar un fenómeno que se llama
We can
fuga
see
de carbono o
a new
carbon
phenomenon that's
leakage en
called
inglés.
carbon leakage.
¿Ese fenómeno qué es? Y que
And what is it about?
cuando uno hace regulaciones ambientales
When
más
you make
estrictas,
more
entonces lo que pasa es
stringent
que las empresas de
environmental
su país
regulations,
se van a producir a otro
domestic
lado y
industries
después
take their production
exportan al
somewhere
país
else.
de
And after
origen.
that,
Les
they
hago el ejemplo
export
con la
to
Unión
the
Europea
domestic country or
como
origin
modelo
country. I
claro.
gives you an example
La
in the
Unión
EU.
Europea, al
The
apretar la
EU,
regulación más grande,
in
lo
tightening
que tienen
regulations,
miedo de hacer
they
es que las
fear
empresas
something. And
europeas
what is that?
se vayan afuera de
European
Europa,
countries, the
produzcan
possibility
en
of
un
having
lugar
these
donde hay menos
companies to get out
regulación
of Europe
y
to
después
produce in a less
reexporten a Europa.
stringent regulatory country,
Eso
and after
sería
that
carbon
export back
leakage,
into the
¿está bien?
EU. That is carbon
Eso
leakage.
sería carbon leakage. Y lo que se ve, si
And
uno
what we
agarra
can
los
see,
datos, este es un paper de unos años, pero
watching
ahora
at
les
the
voy a
data,
mostrar
this
una
paper
figura más actualizada.
is not so
Lo que se ve
updated,
que en
but what
general,
we
si
can
uno
see
mira
that
las emisiones de
generally,
los países
looking at
desarrollados,
the
las emisiones
developed
de
countries'
carbono, en este
emissions,
caso de
carbon
CO2,
emissions, in this case
en
CO2,
realidad tienen una
the
tendencia
truth is
estancada o
that
declinante las
there's a
emisiones
declining or
territoriales, o sea, las
stagnant
emisiones
trend,
que,
and I'm speaking about territorial emissions.
las emisiones que mide la convención, o sea, las
I
del
mean, the emissions
territorio,
measured by
las
the
no de
convention,
consumo, sino las
they
que
are
se producen en el
territorial,
territorio. Uno
territory
diría, bueno,
based,
están
not
bajando
consumption
las
based.
emisiones de los
So you
países
can say that,
desarrollados.
and if you see this
Pero
line,
si
that
uno
the
mira
trend is
las emisiones
declining,
de lo que
but you
consumen
see
esos
the
países desarrollados,
consumption
en realidad la
emissions
imagen
in
es otra,
these
está
developed countries, the
subiendo,
image is different,
justamente
and the
porque los
curve
países en
is going
desarrollados
upwards
tienden a
because
ser
developed countries
importadores netos de
tend
carbono,
to be
o sea,
net
a
carbon
consumir más
importers.
carbono de lo que
This
producen
means
en su
that they
territorio.
use more
Y al
carbon than what they
revés pasa
use
con
in
los
their own
países en desarrollo.
countries.
Los
And this
países en
also happens
desarrollo,
in
cuyas
developing
emisiones
countries
están subiendo,
whose emissions are
tienen más
increasing,
emisiones de lo que producen en
have
su
more
territorio
emissions than
que lo
what
que
their
exportan. ¿Está
production
bien?
demands
¿Se
than in or
entendió?
vis-a-vis the emissions related to
Y esta
exports.
es una imagen más actualizada,
And this is
porque
a
la
more
anterior era de un
updated
paper que
view.
ahora ya tiene unos años. Pero ahora esta es la imagen más
This
actualizada.
is the
Y
picture
ahí lo que se ve es que
today. And what
dentro
can we
mismo de
see
América
here?
Latina el
Inside
panorama no
Latin
es tan
America,
uniforme. Yo
the
antes les
scenario
dije,
is
ah,
not
los países
so
desarrollados, los
uniform or
países en
consistent,
desarrollo. Pero si uno mira dentro de
but
América Latina, por
within
ejemplo,
Latin America,
Brasil y Argentina
Brazil and
son
Argentina
exportadores netos de carbono. O
are
sea,
net carbon
consumen menos
exporters. This
carbono en
means
sus
that they
vidas
consume
de lo que
less
exportan.
carbon in their own goods
Pero,
than
por
what they
ejemplo,
export.
Uruguay y
But
Paraguay
Uruguay
son
and Paraguay
importadores netos de carbono,
are net
porque
carbon importers
consumen más
because they
carbono en su territorio
use
de lo que
more
producen.
carbon
Envían
domestically
eso,
than
¿está
what it
bien?
is produced in their own
Pero si
goods.
ustedes miran Europa,
So,
que yo le decía los países
taking a
desarrollados,
look
supongamos que en
at
ellos
Europe,
vemos
developed
Europa
countries,
y Estados Unidos,
and the United
en
States,
general son importadores netos de carbono.
they are
O sea,
net carbon
consumen bienes
importers.
que
They
tienen carbono y
use or
que
consume
si uno
goods
suma, son
that have
más de lo que
carbon
se
that
produce en
added
el
together are
territorio.
more than
¿Vean?
what it is produced in their
Entonces,
own
ahí está ese
territory.
miedo del carbon
So
leakage, de
this
decir,
is the
bueno,
fear of
en
having a
realidad por
carbon
apretar
leakage
y
situation.
regular
So
mucho el cambio climático,
when
¿qué termina
tightening or
pasando?
regulating
Terminan
climate
produciendo en
change,
otro
you
lado
end up
y terminamos
producing somewhere else,
reimportando
and
y
we
entonces no
import
se resuelve el
back,
problema y
and the
encima
problem is not
perjudicamos a nuestros
resolved, and we are
productores. Ese
damaging
sería el
our own
razonamiento.
domestic producers. That's the
Entonces,
rationale.
¿qué fue haciendo la Unión
So
Europea a lo
what
largo del
has the
tiempo que
EU
terminó en
been
estas
doing
regulaciones
over
de las cuales ya
time that
vamos a
ended
hablar
up in
después?
these regulations that I'm going
Y
to
lo
discuss
primero que
later on?
hizo la Unión Europea fue
The first thing that the EU
a
did
los productos que se
is this:
consideraban carbono
products
riesgosos,
that were
que
carbon
esos eran los
risky,
productos de muchos manufactureros que
many
fueron muy
manufactured products
intensivos en el uso de energía,
that were energy
o sea, que tenían
intensive,
muy carbono intensivos y
were carbon
también muy
intensive
abiertos al
products
comercio
and
internacional.
open to
¿Qué
international
hizo?
trade.
Bueno, la Unión Europea
The
tiene un
EU
sistema de permisos comercializables. ¿Está
has
bien?
a
¿Cómo es el sistema
tradable
de
permit
permisos
system.
comercializables?
I'm
Lo que
going to talk about
hace
this
es,
system.
le da
This
a los
system
productores
gives
que
producers
están dentro de ese sistema
that are within the system
unos derechos a emitir. ¿Está bien?
some
Si los
emission
productores los
permits.
usan,
If they
bárbaro,
are used by the
entregan los
producers, that's
derechos,
fine.
emiten eso y
They
listo.
provide
Pero
these
si
rights,
quieren
they make these
emitir más,
emissions, and that's
tienen que
fine. But if they
comprar
want to
esos
emit
derechos a
more, they need
otros
to
de los
buy
cuales les
these
sobre.
permits
¿Está bien?
to
Y esos
another
derechos tienen
party that
entonces
has
un
excess
precio. ¿Está
permits.
bien?
And those
Un precio
rights
del carbono, que es
have a
un
price.
precio
This
por
is a carbon
tonelada de
price
carbono.
per
Entonces, ¿qué
carbon
empezó
ton.
haciendo la Unión
So,
Europea?
what did
A los
the EU
productores que
do?
tenían mucha intensidad de
Those
carbono
producers that were
y
carbon
también
intensive,
tenían mucho comercio con el resto
that
del
were
mundo,
also
¿vean? Les
traded
empezó a
intensively with the
entregar
rest of the world,
permisos
they
comercializables
were
gratis,
given
¿está bien?
free
¿Para
emission
qué? Y para que no
allowances.
tuvieran que
Why?
comprarlos,
In order
¿está
for
bien?
them
Como
not
todos los
to
demás
buy
productores,
these
y entonces la
allowances,
regulación ambiental
so the
climática no les pesara
environmental
tanto, ¿está
regulation
bien?
wouldn't be a burden to
Entonces
them.
hizo una serie de indicadores
So
que
they
eran
provided
la
some sort
intensidad
of
de
indicators or
carbono, a ver si
metrics,
los
that is
tengo acá,
carbon intensity,
sí, la, la intensidad de carbono y la
carbon
apertura
intensity,
comercial,
and
¿está bien?
trade openness.
Entonces, con esos dos
With these
indicadores de
two
la
metrics,
intensidad de carbono y la
and I
intensidad en
mean
el comercio,
carbon intensity and trade
estableció unos
intensity,
criterios
the EU
y dijo,
established
a
some sort
estos
of
tipos los
criteria,
voy a
and they said,
considerar carbono
I'm going
riesgosos
to
y
consider
les voy
these
a dar
people as
gratis los
carbon
permisos.
intensive, and I'm going to provide them with free
Miren estos
allowances.
criterios. Los
Here you have the
criterios
criteria.
viejos, después ya ahora es otra cosa, pero los primeros criterios
The
que eran,
early criteria
o bien que la intensidad de carbono fuera
were
más de
about having
5% y la
carbon intensity
intensidad de
higher than
comercio más de
5% and the trade
10%,
intensity more than
o
10%,
bien que la intensidad de
or
carbono fuera más que
the carbon
30%,
intensity higher than
o bien que la
30%,
intensidad de comercio
and the
fuera
last
más que
one
el treinta por
having
ciento,
trade
califiquen
intensity
más.
having more than
Como
or
parece
higher than
raro, les voy a
30%.
mostrar un gráfico.
I'm
¿Está
going to
bien?
show you a graph to illustrate
Voy a
this.
ir un poco más lento porque esto seguro que les resulta un poco difícil.
I'm not
O sea, el
going to
criterio
go
A
fast because
es
this
que
is
no
has a bit
tenga tanta
complicated.
intensidad de carbono y tanta
Criterion
apertura
A,
comercial, pero
not so
algo sí.
much
El
carbon,
criterio B es
neither
que tenga mucha
trade.
intensidad de
Criterion
carbono.
B,
Y el criterio
intensity of
C es que
carbon.
tenga
And
mucha
criterion
intensidad
C,
comercial.
intensity
Y
of
ahora les pongo los
trade.
146
And
sectores
here
acá.
you can
¿Está
see
bien?
146
Entonces,
sectors in this
los
graph.
azules son los
The
que
blue
tienen
ones
más de 30% de la
are
intensidad
those
de
which
comercio.
have
O sea,
more
comercian
than
mucho con el resto del mundo.
30% of
Ese es el
trade.
cuadrado azul.
So they trade a lot
Más
with
de
the rest of the world.
30% de
This is
intensidad de
the
comercio.
blue
Después, el cuadrado
rectangle.
rojo es los que
The
tienen mucha
red one
intensidad
shows those
bien?
which are carbon
Y el
intensive,
cuadrado verde son
and
los
the
que
green
tienen
rectangle
una
shows
combinación. ¿Está bien?
those which have a
Entonces,
combination
la
between
crítica,
carbon and trade.
yo hasta ahora les vengo diciendo
So
lo que
far,
piensa la Unión
I've
Europea
been
para hacer
telling you
este
what
régimen.
the
¿Está bien?
European
Es
Union
decir, yo me
believes
quiero proteger de la fuga de
the ideas
carbono
in this
porque lo que quiero hacer
scheme. I want to
es
protect myself from carbon
darle
leakage
permisos
because I want to
gratuitos a los que o
provide
tienen mucha
free
intensidad de
allowances to
carbono o
those who
mucha
have
competencia.
are
¿Está bien?
high carbon intensity
Entonces,
or they have a
ahora les
lot
voy a
of
decir el otro
competition.
lado de la
Now
moneda,
I'm
que es
going
la
to show you
crítica. ¿Y
the
la
other side of
crítica
the
cuál
coin.
es? La
What
crítica es
can
que
we
si ustedes
criticize
miran todos
here?
los
If you have a
puntitos
look at
que
all the
son todos los
dots
sectores según el código NACE,
showing
en
all
realidad
the
tiene
sectors
más
according
que
to
ver
the
con que tengan
NACE
mucha apertura comercial
nomenclature,
que con que
those
tengan mucha intensidad de
it has to
carbono,
do with open
porque le está
market
dando
instead of
permisos gratuitos a todos
carbon
estos que
intensity,
no tienen
because
mucha intensidad de
allowances
carbono, sino que están
are
expuestos al
given to
comercio
these
muy
which
fuertemente.
are exposed
Entonces
to
tienen la
trade
amenaza
vigorously.
de que el
So the
que
threat
produce en un
that
país que tiene
somebody
regulaciones
producing in a
ambientales
country with
laxas entre
lenient
a la Unión
environmental
Europea a
regulations
competir con
may
alguien que
get
tiene
into Europe
regulaciones ambientales estrictas.
competing
¿Está bien?
with a country
Entonces
which is
algunos
submitted
dicen,
or
ah, es
somebody
más
which
que
is
todo
submitted
un
to
proteccionismo verde, no es
strict
verdaderamente por el carbono.
environmental
¿Está bien?
regulations.
Esa
So
es la crítica.
it is not all
Después vamos a
exclusively
tener tiempo para
dependent
preguntas,
upon
así que
carbon.
seguramente
I'm
si
going to
ahora no
devote
les
some
quedó
time
claro,
to
puedo
questions.
volver
So
sobre
if
esto.
something is not clear,
Entonces
I'm
ahora,
willing to
qué
go
voy
back
a
and
hacer? Voy a
explain
enganchar esto que
further.
acabo de decir,
I'm going to
que
link what
esto
I've
es
just
como empezó
presented.
la Unión Europea con lo que
This is
hace
the
ahora la
beginning
Unión
of the
Europea. ¿Está bien?
European Union, and I'm going
Entonces,
to show you
ahora la Unión
what it
Europea, ¿qué
does
hace?
now.
Y acá les remito a un trabajo que acabo de publicar, que es lo que les voy a
I'm showing
contar
you
ahora.
now a paper I've
La
just
Unión Europea,
published.
¿qué hace
The
ahora?
European Union
Tiene, la Unión Europea tiene dos cosas, ¿está
has two
bien?
things.
Tiene, déjenme que voy a engancharlo, tengo que engancharlo.
Let me
La Unión
find
Europea tiene dos cosas, ¿está
the
bien?
information I want to post. So I was telling you,
Dos
the
cosas.
European
Uno
Union has
es
two
los
aspects
ajustes de
to be borne
carbono
in
en
mind.
frontera.
One
Uno,
is the
ajustes de carbono en
border
frontera.
carbon
Y
adjustments,
dos,
BCAs,
que ese es un
and
mecanismo de precios. ¿Está
and
bien?
there
Que
is
ahora
a
les voy a decir
price
cómo funciona.
mechanism. And I'm going to
Y
show you
dos,
how
el
this
segundo
price
coso que
mechanism
tiene
works.
es
And the
la
second thing
prohibición de
to
importar
underline
a la Unión
is
Europea bienes que
the
no puedan
European Union
probar que
is
fueron
banned
producidos sin
to
deforestar. ¿Está bien?
import
Entonces vamos a ver esas dos
products
cosas.
which are not deforestation
Esas
free.
dos cosas.
So
Entonces, ¿qué es lo que
let
vamos a
us
ver de esas
delve
dos
into
cosas?
these two
Vamos a ver
fields.
cuál es la exposición de los
This
países de
takes us
América
to the
Latina a esos dos
exposure of
mecanismos.
Latin
¿Qué
American
quiere decir
countries
la
to these two
exposición?
mechanisms.
Quiere
What do
decir
we
qué
mean when we say
porcentaje del
exposure? The
comercio de los países
percentage
de
of
América Latina está
trade of
expuesto a estos
Latin American
mecanismos.
countries
O sea, se vería
exposed to
afectado por
these
estos
mechanisms. That
mecanismos.
is to say,
Y después vamos
affected
a ver cómo si la
by these
exposición
mechanisms.
cambiara, o sea, se
If
ampliara a más
exposure
bienes y
changed
más países
and
hicieran este
included
tipo de
more goods
regulación,
and more
cómo
countries with this type of
cambiaría, si sería
regulation,
más grave, cuánto
what
más
would
grave
be
sería.
the scenario?
Y
It would
después
be
vamos a ver no la
more
exposición, sino cuál es
serious,
la
less serious.
vulnerabilidad.
The
¿Qué quiere
second
decir la
notion to be
vulnerabilidad?
borne in mind is
Quiere decir
vulnerability.
no si estoy expuesto o no, sino si
I
realmente me
do
va a
not mean
afectar.
whether I'm
¿Y
exposed or
eso
not.
con qué
I
va a tener
mean
que ver?
whether I'm
Va a
going to
tener que
be
ver con dos cosas.
impacted. And
Va a
this
tener que
impact
ver
is related to
con
two things.
si yo realmente tengo una
First,
intensidad de
whether
carbono baja, ¿está
my
bien?
carbon
Si
intensity
tengo
is
baja no me va a
low.
afectar. O
If
sea,
it
voy a
is
estar
low, I'm
expuesto,
going to
pero no
be
voy a ser
impacted. I'm going
vulnerable,
to be
porque
exposed, but not
no me importa.
vulnerable,
Vos me decís,
because I don't
ah,
care about this.
si vos
If
tenés
you
mucha intensidad de carbono,
have
te cobro un
a
precio.
lot
Pero si
of
yo la
carbon
tengo baja, no
intensity,
voy
I'm
a ser
going to charge a
vulnerable.
high
Voy a
price. But
estar
if
expuesto, pero no
it's
voy a
low,
ser vulnerable.
I'm going to be
Y otra
exposed,
cosa por
but
la que
I'm not
puedo
going to
no ser
be
vulnerable es
vulnerable. And
porque
another
la Unión
aspect
Europea
why I'm
toma
not
esta
going to be
regulación,
vulnerable
pero
is
yo agarro y
if
les
the
exporto a
European
otros.
Union
¿Viste? Vos me pones
affects or
esta
imposes
traba,
the
voy y les
regulation,
exporto
what can I do? I
¿viste? a Estados
can
Unidos,
export to other countries, for example, the United States, Asia markets, which do not have this regulation. So what I try to do is to overcome this regulation. So we're going to see now more in detail exposure and vulnerability.
Entonces, déjenme avanzar.
Let me
Entonces,
find
¿qué es la exposición?
the
El
next idea. What
ajuste
is exposure?
de carbono en frontera
CBA,
es como les
border
decía
carbon
antes.
adjustment, is
Lo
what
voy a
I
repetir
told
para que
you
les quede
before.
claro.
I'm going to repeat
Entonces, el ajuste
for
de
this
carbono en
notion to be
frontera es
clear.
así. Yo exporto de
PCA
Argentina a
means that
Europa.
if I export from
¿Está bien?
Argentina to Europe,
Si mi intensidad de carbono de mi bien,
if
supongamos yo
my
exporto
carbon
aluminio,
intensity of my
es
good,
menor que la
let us
de
say
los países
aluminum,
del
and
productor
this
europeo, si es
value
menor,
is
no tengo que
lower
pagar
than the
nada,
European
porque
one, if it
exporto a
is
Europa,
lower,
ningún
I don't
problema.
have to pay anything. I can
Si
export
mi
without any
intensidad
problems.
de carbono,
If
o
my
sea, el
carbon
carbono que hay
intensity,
dentro de mi producto, es
which
mayor
is
que el de
inside
la
my
Unión
good,
Europea,
is
por esa
bigger
diferencia de
than the
intensidad de
value in
carbono,
Europe,
yo tengo
due
que
to that
pagar.
difference, I have
¿Qué
to
es lo
pay.
que tengo que pagar?
What
Tengo
do I
que
have to pay?
comprar
You
un
may wonder. I
permiso.
have to
Ese permiso
buy
tiene un
an
precio,
allowance,
que es el mismo precio
a
que tienen los
permit,
permisos de
which
carbono
is
en la Unión
the
Europea.
same
Pero
value
yo puedo
that exists in the
deducir de ese
European
pago
Union. But I
si ya
may
pagué carbono en un
deduce or
país.
subtract from that payment if I
Argentina,
have already
Colombia,
paid
Chile,
in my country,
México,
Argentina,
Uruguay,
Colombia, Chile,
5
Mexico, and
países de
Uruguay.
América Latina
5 countries in
tienen un
Latin
impuesto
America
al carbono.
have
Entonces, si
a
yo ya pagué
minimum
ese
tax on
impuesto al
carbon.
carbono
So if I have
en mi
already
país,
paid that tax in
puedo
my own
deducirlo
country, I
de lo que
may
tengo que
deduct
pagar
or
en la Unión
subtract
Europea. Brasil
from
no
what I have
tiene
to
ese
pay in
precio
Europe.
al carbono,
Brazil does
entonces
not
no
have
podría
this
deducir haber pagado
tax
por
on
el
carbon,
carbono.
so it
Pero
won't be able to
Argentina,
make this
Chile,
subtraction. But
Colombia,
Argentina,
Uruguay,
Chile, Colombia,
México,
Uruguay, and
esos
Mexico,
5 pagan
these
ese
5
precio al carbono. Entonces sí
pay
lo
for
podrían deducir.
carbon domestically. That's why they
Y
can
después, el otro
deduct this
mecanismo, el
value when they go
DFP,
to
el
Europe.
Deforestation Free,
And the
ese
other
es un instrumento de
mechanisms, which is
cantidades.
DFP,
¿Qué quiere decir?
deforestation free
Está
product,
prohibido
it has to do
importarle a
with
la
the
Unión
quantity. So
Europea
it is
bienes
banned
que no pueden
to
probar que fueron
import to
producidos
Europe
sin deforestar.
goods
¿Está bien?
which you have to
¿Cómo
prove
puedo
that were
sin
produced
deforestar a partir de diciembre
without
de 2020? ¿Está
deforestation
bien?
from
Entonces, ¿cómo
December
puedo
2020
probar
onwards.
que produjo
How am I
sin
going to
deforestar?
show
Y
my
tengo que
product
dar las
is a
coordenadas
DFP? I have to
de
provide the
dónde produjo,
coordinates,
las coordenadas
the
geográficas.
geographical
Y con
coordinates of where
imágenes satelitales
I
se puede ver
produce,
si
and
se
with satellite
deforestó
imaging
desde 2020 o no.
since
¿Está bien?
2020, you can see
Y ese
whether there has
escrutinio
been
a los
deforestation or
productores
not.
va a
And
depender
this
de qué?
scrutiny
Va a
on
depender de qué
producers
estadística del
depends
país como
on the
deforestador. Va a haber
statistics
tres
or the
categorías de
statistical value
países:
of the country
baja
as a
deforestación,
deforester.
mediana
Low
deforestación,
deforestation,
alta deforestación.
intermediate, and high
Y
deforestation
según
are the
la
three
categoría
categories.
donde esté
And
el
depending
país
upon
donde
the
uno
categories
produce, va a
to
tener que
which the
producir
country
más o menos
belongs, the
evidencia
country will
para
have to
probar
provide more
que el
or
país ha
less
producido
evidence
sin
to
deforestar.
show that the
O
product in
sea
question
que
is
en este caso,
DFP.
aunque uno no
In this
deforeste
case,
nada, ¿está
although
bien?
you are
Igual va a
not
tener
involved
un
in any
costo el
kind of
productor de
deforestation, the
proveer la
producer
evidencia,
will
¿está
have
bien?
a
Y eso
cost
también va
associated
a
because the
pasar con
producer
el
has to
ajuste
show
de carbono en
evidence. And the
frontera,
same
porque
happens
va a
with
haber que probar
BCA
el contenido de
because the
carbono, o
producer
sea que
has
va a
to
haber que hacer
show
huellas
how
de
much
carbono,
carbon
etcétera.
there
¿Está
is
bien?
in his or her product through,
Entonces,
for example,
para ver
carbon
la
footprint.
exposición, ¿qué es
In
lo que
order to
vamos a
see
hacer?
the exposure, what
Vamos
are
a
we going to
mirar
do?
qué
We're going
bienes hay
to
en cada regulación. ¿Está
consider
bien?
the goods in each
Entonces, ¿qué
regulation.
bienes hay en cada regulación? En la del,
Here we see the
y lo
product
que
scope.
nosotros hicimos fue mirar la
We
regulación europea, que ahora ya está
explored
aprobada. Cuando
the
empezamos
European
todavía no estaba en sus estadios finales,
regulation,
cuando
which
empezamos a hacer
now
este
is
trabajo, pero ahora
enforced.
ya
When we
está.
started our work,
Pero
it had
también
not
miramos
been
la regulación
enacted.
que
And
tiene
we also have a
proyectos
look
en
at
Estados Unidos. O sea, hay proyectos de
the
ley
different
introducidos al
bills in
Congreso.
the state.
Si
if you if you consult the paper, you will have the QR in the presentation. You can consult the details there if you are interested. The first thing we discovered at that moment is that there are many similarities, cement, iron, and steel in both. There are many goods which appear either in Europe or in North America. And the same occurs with border adjustments
para la de prohibición de importar si no podés probar que deforestaste.
and deforestation-free products.
Lo que hicimos es tomar
What did we
como
do?
base
Let me
ese
show you.
escenario.
We
Pero ¿qué
took
pasa?
that
Todas las
situation
naciones que hay de
as
estas
the
cosas
foundation,
unilaterales
and then we
dicen
had a look at
que pueden,
unilateral
bueno, ahora
regulations.
son estos bienes,
All
pero
these
después pueden
regulations say,
incorporarse
here
más.
is a
¿Está
list,
bien?
but this
O
list
sea,
may be
es abrir
longer
la
in the
puerta para
future.
que haya
This
más
opens
bienes
the
que se
door
incorporen.
for more
Entonces, lo que hicimos
goods
nosotros es
to be
hacer
added to
algunos
the list.
escenarios sobre qué
That's
otros
why
bienes se
we
podían incorporar.
designed several scenarios
Entonces, en los
with
escenarios lo que
probable
hicimos fue
goods
poner
incorporated
otros
in the
bienes
future.
que, por ejemplo, en el escenario 1 pusimos
In
bienes que
scenario 1, we
no están
added goods
en la regulación de Carbon Border Adjustment,
which
pero
are
sí
not included
estaban
in the CBA
en la lista de
regulation,
bienes carbono riesgosos.
but they
Entonces algún día
are
podrían
on the
entrar.
list of
Y en
DFP,
el
so they
escenario 2 lo
might
que
be
hicimos es
included
poner
eventually.
bienes
And
que
in
no
scenario
estaban ni en
2,
la lista de
we
carbono
included
riesgosos
goods
ni en
which
la
were
industria
neither
petrolera, pero
on the
que sí la Unión
CBA
Europea
nor
tiene
on the DFP
metodologías
lists,
para calcular la huella
but
ambiental.
which
Entonces,
are
eso nos
covered by
parecía que eran bienes
methodologies
donde
to
era más fácil
calculate
que se
carbon
corriera la
footprint.
regulación hacia
So
ahí.
we believe
Y
that
después, para
those were
deforestation free, lo que hicimos
probable
fue agregar
candidates
bienes que
for
se
regulations to be
analizaron, pero que
implemented.
finalmente
Then
no se incorporaron,
we
pero que
analyzed some
son los
goods
que más
which
están a
were
mano
not
para irse hacia
incorporated,
ahí.
but will
Entonces,
probably
para que se
be
den una idea,
included. For you to have an idea,
esta cosa, en este diagrama de Venn, en el círculo más
in
grande, el
this
más negro,
Venn
son sectores que
diagram,
alguna vez
you
se
can see
analizaron para
the
considerarlos
outer
carbono
circle
riesgosos.
are sectors which
La
were
que es
once
gris un
considered to
poco más
be
oscura
carbon
son
risky.
sectores que
Dark gray,
están considerados
inside the
carbono
circle,
riesgosos en el comercio,
we
en el
have
sistema de comercios de permisos
carbon
comercializables.
risk
Y los que se
in the
incluyeron
different
finalmente
agreements, and
dentro del
those
ajuste de
which
frontera es un
were included
subgrupo
in
de
the
esos, un
BCA
grupo
circle
muy
is a
pequeño de
subgroup,
esos.
it's a
O sea
small
que hay
subgroup.
potencial para
So there
expandir a
is
otros
potential
sectores.
to
¿Está bien?
expand
Hasta
this
ahora solamente
circle
es unos
onto the
pocos.
others. So far, just a few
Entonces, ¿qué hicimos
inside.
nosotros? Y lo que
What did we
hicimos
do then?
nosotros
We
fue medir exposición como qué,
measure the
como qué
exposure
parte de las
as
exportaciones
a
de
part
esos bienes,
of exports of those goods.
qué partes de qué parte representan en las exportaciones totales
The
del
share they
país
represent
esos
in the
bienes.
total
Esa es la
exports
medida
of
más
the country.
fácil
That's
que
the
vamos a ver
easiest
por ahora.
way of
Entonces, para eso, ¿qué
measuring
tuvimos que
so
hacer?
far.
Tuvimos que traducir
We had
la
at that
normativa en la
moment to
nomenclatura que
translate the
estaba
nomenclature,
al
the
código
regulations
de exportaciones, que es el
into the
sistema armonizado.
export code,
Entonces,
which is the
hicimos esa
harmonized
traducción
system.
para poder ver
We
cuánto
made that
representaba del
transfer
comercio.
in order to see how much
¿Está bien? O
or
sea,
what is the share
tradujimos
of trade.
de la nomenclatura en que
So
estaba la
from the
regulación
nomenclature,
a
the existing
la
nomenclature,
regulación del
we
sistema
took
armonizado a
the
seis
notion
dígitos.
and
¿Está bien?
we translated that
Una vez
into
que
the
hicimos la traducción, ¿está
six-digit
bien?
HS.
Pudimos,
Once we
pudimos hacer
did this
este
operation,
indicador. O sea,
we arrived
cuánto de
at
las
this
exportaciones
indicator.
de cada país de ese bien
How
al
much
destino de la Unión
exports
Europea
from that countries of that good to the
era
EU
sobre el total de las
was based
exportaciones de
on
ese país.
total
Bien.
exports of that country.
Muy bien. Eso para la exposición. Y ahora en un
That is in
poquito
relation
nomás
to
le voy a mostrar
exposure.
los resultados que obtuvimos. Pero
Later on,
después
I'm going to
para la
show you our
vulnerabilidad, ¿qué es lo
conclusions.
que
But in
hicimos?
relation to
Para la
vulnerability,
vulnerabilidad lo que hicimos fue dos cosas.
we did two things.
Dos cosas hicimos. Por un lado, hicimos
On the one
cuál era la
hand,
intensidad de carbono de los bienes.
the goods carbon
Porque
intensity.
de eso va a
That's
depender la
what we
vulnerabilidad en el
discussed,
primer
because
mecanismo,
that
en el
is going to
carbon border
determine the
adjustment.
vulnerability of
¿Y
the
cómo va a
first
ser la
mechanism, or the
vulnerabilidad en el
CBAM.
deforestation free?
And
Y va a
how does
depender de cuál
vulnerability
sea
relate to deforestation free?
de cuál
And that
sea
is
la
going to
intensidad de la
depend
deforestación que vos
on
haces.
deforestation
El problema
intensity.
con la
The
deforestación es que
problem with
no hay
deforestation,
de intensidad de carbono hay números, ¿está
we
bien?
have figures
Pero
for
de la
carbon
deforestación
intensity,
hay números por
but
país, por ejemplo
in
estos.
relation to deforestation,
¿Cuánto
we
se
have
deforesta por la producción
countrywide
de carne en
data.
Brasil? Un
How much do
montón.
you
Pero lo
deforest
que no hay
to produce beef in
es
Brazil?
número
There's a lot of data
por
about that.
kilo de carne,
But we
¿está
don't
bien?
have numbers per
Sino que
kilogram
hay
of
por los
beef.
productos, pero de todos los
We see this
productos que
broken
produce el
down
país.
by
Por ejemplo,
country, but all the
Ecuador,
country
el
produced in the
cocoa
products
tiene
in the
bastante
country. In Ecuador,
deforestación,
cocoa
pero no está definido por la
production
cantidad de
entails a lot of
kilos de carne que
deforestation,
se
but it's not
produce. No
measured
hay
by
intensidad.
the number of
Muy bien,
kilograms
pero bueno,
produced.
entonces para deforestation la vulnerabilidad no la
For
hicimos, pero
deforestation, we didn't
para
do
carbon
a
borders
vulnerability
lo que hicimos
analysis, but
fue
we
la
actually did it for
intensidad de
carbon
carbono de
border.
cada uno de
We
los bienes
measured the
en cada
carbon
uno de los
intensity
países.
of each
Y
goods
después
in
lo que
each
hicimos
country.
también para pensar cómo eludir esta
In
regulación
order to
es
think how
calcular
we
la
could avoid this
concentración de
regulation
las
is to calculate the
exportaciones.
concentration of
Y eso lo hicimos con
exports.
un índice que es estándar, que es el
And we
índice
applied a standard index,
Herfindahl-Hirschman.
the
Esto es
HHI
así.
or
Este índice
Herfindahl-Hirschman.
es
This
1, ¿está bien?
index
Si uno
is
exporta a
1
un solo
if you
mercado.
export towards a
Entonces, si
single
yo
market.
exporto, no
And
sé,
I mean,
carne
if I
solamente a la
export
Unión
beef
Europea,
only
¿está
to the
bien?
European
Si los
Union,
productores de Argentina importan
if
carne solo
Argentina
de la Unión
produces
Europea, su vulnerabilidad
export
es
countries
altísima.
to the
¿Está
EU,
bien?
its vulnerability is
Porque
very
la
high
carne,
because
varios
beef
códigos de la carne
and its related codes
están sujetos a esto, al deforestation free.
are subject to
Entonces ahí habría
deforestation-free
poca manera de
rules.
zafar y poco poder de
So we
negociación,
wouldn't be
porque no tenés a
able
dónde ir.
to negotiate here.
Mientras
There's
que si
little
vos
room for
tenés
negotiation.
diversificadas las
But,
exportaciones
but on the
y el
contrary, if
índice
you
fuerte es
diversified
cero,
exports and the
entonces, bueno, la
index
Unión
tends to be
Europea me
zero,
cierra las
then the
puertas, voy y
EU
vendo para otro
closes
y me
all
voy
doors, and then I knock
diversificando.
somebody else's door, and I create
Muy bien.
diversification here.
Entonces, ahora
So
vamos a los resultados. Bien.
let's see the results now.
Entonces, ahora vamos a los resultados. Ahora vamos a los resultados. Entonces, vamos ahora ya a mirar con más atención los resultados.
Now,
Creo que
focusing on
todavía tenemos un
results,
rato, ¿no?
I
Todavía
think,
tenemos un
Veronica,
rato.
do I still have
Tenés
some minutes?
unos 10 minutos,
10
15.
minutes,
Bárbaro,
10 or
bárbaro,
15
sí.
minutes at the most.
Bueno, entonces, primero vamos a ver los resultados a nivel de las
Now, coming back
regiones.
to the presentation,
Entonces, estos son los
results
resultados
based
del
on each
ajuste de
regions.
carbono en frontera.
These are the
Que
results of
tienen que ver
CBA
con
relating
todos estos bienes.
to
¿Está
all
bien?
these goods
Y
that you can
esto
see
es
here.
Latinoamérica.
This is Latin
O sea
America.
que a cómo está hoy la regulación de los ajustes
Based
en
on
fronteras,
today's regulations
Latinoamérica
of
no
carbon
está muy
adjustment,
expuesta.
Latin
O
America
sea,
doesn't
muy
have high
poco de sus
exposure.
exportaciones son de esos
Very
rubros. ¿Está bien?
few
Entonces,
exports
es como
belong
que
to
por
these
ahora no hay
products,
tanto de qué
so
preocuparse. ¿Está
we
bien?
shouldn't
Porque
be
si uno toma
so
todas las
concerned right now,
exportaciones de
because if you take the
Latinoamérica
total Latin American
en esos
exports
rubros a la Unión Europea, es re
to the
poquito.
EU,
¿Está bien?
it's
Los que
really
están afectados.
very,
Y
very
eso
few
mismo lo
countries
vamos
that
a ver
are
ahora a nivel de
affected.
países.
And we can break it down
A nivel de países,
by
miren cómo
country.
es. A nivel, no, todavía no. Todavía a nivel de países
No,
no.
I'm sorry, it's not
Seguimos con lo regional.
country-wise.
Vuelvo
We
a esto.
continue
Esto
with
es
the
el ajuste
regional
de carbono en
picture.
fronteras a nivel
This
de
is
regiones.
CBA by
Ahora
regions.
vamos a el deforestation free
Now,
a nivel de
deforestation
regiones.
free
¿Está bien?
at a regional
Y esto
level.
es Latinoamérica y el Caribe.
This is
¿Está
Latin
bien?
America and the
Y
Caribbean.
es más importante. ¿Está bien? O sea, dijimos
And you
0,11
see
del Carbon Border Adjustment, pero
0.11 CBA, but
1,72% de todas las
1.72% of
exportaciones
total
en
exports
deforestation free.
in deforestation
Pero
free.
más que nosotros, los que están peor son
But the
África
worst
subsahariana.
case
África
scenario
subsahariana sí
is
estaría más
sub-Saharan
afectada
Africa
que
would be
Latinoamérica.
more
¿Está bien?
complicated and in a more
Y otra
difficult
cosa que
situation
vimos
than
es
Latin
que
America.
la regulación
Another finding
norteamericana
is that the
por
United
su
States
código de la
regulation
barca,
and due
si
to its
fuera
codes,
aprobada,
if it
sería
were approved,
más débil para
it would be
nosotros
weaker
que la
for us
regulación europea.
than the
Tendría
European
menos impacto.
regulation. It would
Porque si
have
bien son
a
rubros
lower
parecidos,
impact. If
son
I
menos
think in
códigos.
about
Y en esos
different
códigos
or
nosotros no
similar
tenemos
products, they are
tantas
different codes.
exportaciones.
And with those codes,
Entonces,
our
ahora
imports
sí a
are not
nivel
that
de
much
países. ¿Está bien?
or
Esto
that
es
many. Now,
Carbon Border Adjustment a
countrywide,
nivel de
this is
países.
Carbon Border
Para
Adjustment or
Argentina
CBA
prácticamente es nada.
based on each country. For Argentina, it's
Prácticamente
almost
nada de sus
none.
exportaciones. Porque
None of
Argentina
its
no
imports
exporta
because
mucho aluminio,
Argentina does
cemento,
not
hierro y acero,
export
fertilizantes.
aluminium,
No es un
cement,
gran
iron and steel, and
exportador.
fertilizers. It's not
Pero para
an
Brasil
important
sería algo
importer,
más,
but
pero
for
sigue
Brazil,
siendo poco.
it would
¿Está
be
bien?
more
O sea,
significant, but it's still little.
0,40% de todas las
0.40%
exportaciones de
of
Brasil
total
se verían
Brazilian
afectadas.
exports would be
Y ustedes
affected.
ven en qué es hierro y acero,
And you would see here iron and steel.
prácticamente es el total. ¿Está
It's
bien?
almost hits the
Entonces vuelvo a
total
decir, como está
in
ahora
those two
Carbon Border
products.
Adjustment, a
The
ningún
CBA
país de
to
la
date
región le movería la aguja mucho. ¿Está bien?
would complicate matters for any country in the region.
Y esto es si uno expande a
This
escenarios
picture
donde más
is
bienes son
when you
cubiertos. Y
expand
ahí sí, donde
to
más
more or
donde más
include
bienes son
more
cubiertos es más
goods.
importante. Para
So when you
Brasil
include more
sería
goods, it's more important. So
6,8% de
for
sus
Brazil, it's
exportaciones.
6.8% of its
Recuerden que
total
más bienes
exports.
cubiertos significa que
More covered
serían
goods.
todos los
What do I mean
bienes
by
que
this? All
fueron
goods
considerados carbono
that
riesgosos en el
were
sistema de comercio
considered
europeo,
as
el
carbon
comercio de
risky
emisiones europeo,
in the
y además
ETS
incluiría
in the
los bienes
European
que
Union,
tuvieran definida
including
un
goods
cálculo de huella ambiental
that
elaborado.
have a
¿Está bien?
defined
O sea que
carbon
abarcaría más
footprint
bienes de
already
los que abarca
determined
actualmente.
in Europe.
Y ahí
So it would
pasaría
encompass
Brasil
more
de
goods than now.
0,4 a
So Brazil
6,9.
moves from
Entonces sí,
0.4
el
to
miedo de que se
6.9.
expanda más
So the
bienes
fear
es
of
legítimo porque
expanding into more
sería muy
products is a
importante.
legitimate fear because
Jamaica
it would
sería
create a
casi
higher impact. So
14% de sus
Jamaica would have
exportaciones.
almost 13% of its
Ahora,
exports or
¿cuán
total exports.
vulnerables serían? ¿Cuán
How
vulnerables serían?
vulnerable,
Sería, ¿cuánto de estos bienes serían,
how
pongámosle
vulnerable
acá,
would each
cuántos
country
de
be?
estos bienes serían
How many of these
vulnerables
goods would be
realmente? O sea, tendrían
vulnerable, really
un
vulnerable?
contenido de carbono
And I mean
mayor
these
que
goods having a higher
el
carbon
europeo.
content than the
Entonces, esta
European
rayita
goods.
es el
So this
contenido de
dotted
carbono
line is
del
about
hierro y
the
acero
carbon
en
content
la
of iron
Unión
and steel
Europea.
in the
¿Está bien?
European Union.
Y todos estos
And
puntitos son
all
todos
these
los
other
países de
dots
América Latina.
are Latin
¿Está bien? Y
American
este es
countries.
Brasil.
And this
O
is
sea que
Brazil.
ustedes son de Brasil
You are
y
Brazilian,
les traje
so
este ejemplo. Y
I
ahí lo que
brought
se
this
ve es que
example to
hierro y
you. What you can
acero,
see that in
con
iron and
datos de
steel,
2019 de antes de
with
la pandemia,
2019
Brasil
data,
tiene más
pre-pandemic data,
contenido que la
Brazil
Unión
has
Europea
more content than the
en
EU
producir
in
más
terms
contenido de carbono
of
en hierro de acero. O sea que
carbon
le tocaría
content.
pagar.
So, under these
Entonces,
conditions,
no
they
sería
would have
tanto
to
de sus
pay.
exportaciones,
It's not
0,4%,
about their
pero
export, that
le
is
tocaría pagar.
0.4%, but they should
Y
be
así uno lo puede
making
hacer
a
con
payment
todos los
here.
bienes. Nosotros tenemos
So we can
una
do
herramienta en
or make
Excel
this
que puede ver
analysis
el
with
país y
all the goods. We have an Excel tool with countries and their goods in order to run this comparison for all countries. Then we have deforestation free. We said that the situation is even more serious. For Brazil, this accounts for 5% of its exports. With this EU mechanism, 5% of its exports, soy, timber, beef, and coffee, these exports would be exposed to these regulations. And I mean, Brazilian producers would need to show that they have not incurred in any deforestation practice. And the American regulation is weaker or more lenient. 5 with EU. If the United States approved theirs, it would be just 1%, with the exception of the Guatemalan case that is opposite, and also for Uruguay. Uruguay is a little lower, Guatemala is higher. Or Nicaragua, rather. So the United States regulation is not so stringent. So you might say that it's just a little amount in exports, but what does it represent, or how is the sector impacted by it? So I brought the Peruvian case here. Here you see just 1% of Peru's total exports that are exposed to deforestation free. Just only 1%. But if you break it down by sectors, you see this brown color, it's coffee. It's 1% of the total exports that I said. But about coffee exports, it accounts for 51%. So the coffee sector says, okay, you don't care about that because it's just 1% of a country's exports. But if I get involved in my own country, coffee or cocoa, the number is very big. So half of coffee exporters in Peru is going to run into this kind of problem. So sector-wise, this is significant, even though it is not countrywide. So we did this estimate. How important is it for the Latin American region? And we said, no, the answer is not, it's not so important. And then we thought about how important it is for countries. And carbon border adjustment is nothing, it's less than 1%. Deforestation free for the Mercosur countries is 5% of its total exports. But after that, we broke it down by sectors. And we saw here that within each sector, it might be significant, actually, because 51% of what you export to the EU is subject to this EU regulation. The number is really very high. And I'm coming to the end of my presentation. And here is, if you can avoid this situation, what is your likelihood to export to somebody else? And this is the average of the HHI. And we flagged the degree of seriousness. Honduras, or Colombia, rather, Colombia exports to the EU and many other places as well. So it has a green flag because the European Union closes its doors, so they do not have any problem because they can diversify their exports somewhere else. Brazil also holds some flags here because they have 86 additional countries to which they can export. So they are not really concerned about the EU regulation. They are concerned, but they have options, other options. The problem are these small countries, island countries, or even Mexico. These small islands again, and Mexico, where their exports are highly concentrated in the EU, and very few additional countries. So these regulations are not easily avoidable. They need to build relationships with other parties in order to circumvent the EU regulations. But there's always the chance for Latin American countries to make a decision, and it's rather than having an adaptation behavior, they can stand up to the WTO because of these unilateral measures. And if they don't do that, and if that option is not successful, what are the possible paths to follow? Regarding the CBA, the possible path would be to quantify the carbon footprint for affected products. That is a technical analysis that you can conduct to compare your production with Europeans' production. Another path is not to pay carbon taxes by indirectly, I do pay carbon. For instance, other taxes in place that are implicit carbon taxes. This is a way to reduce costs. And regarding deforestation, what can you do? Countrywide, you have to try to keep indexes low in order for private producers not to be so much scrutinized, and then in the private sector to have traceability tools and non-deforestation evidence where production is held. The better the data, the more possibilities or the higher the likelihood to comply with these regulations. So that's all. That would be all. Thank you so much for your presentation, Mariana. You were like a teacher. So participants are sending or are saying thank you to you. And now we would like to give the floor to Mauricio Mosquita Moreira for some additional comments. He was introduced.
Mauricio Mezquita is the principal economic advisor of the Integration and Trade Sector of the Inter-American Development Bank. Thank you, Veronica. I'm going to speak in the official language of a mixture of Portuguese and Spanish. I think it was very complete. Her analysis, I think, is extremely useful. Results are reasonable, are those which you expect from the design of the measures, the standard of specialization of our countries in terms of bilateral trade with Europe. As Mariana said, that kind of contribution is just one of pieces of a puzzle. The conclusions dealing with impact have to do with a general impact model, considering the direct and indirect impacts on prices and quantities, incorporating all the details of the implementation. The mechanisms whose details are not known. I don't know whether you have debated in other presentations, in other sessions of the course, but there are some exercises working with C-band or with BCA, but I don't know any dealing with DFP. Those which have to do with C-band show rather small details and heterogeneous in terms of countries, which is consistent with the results presented by Mariana. That's why the 2021 UNCTAD report assumes a price of carbon of cut-and trade of $43, which is below the current price, which is practically $90. That would mean, for example, a tariff, an ad valorem tariff, which will vary between 0.3% for paper in Peru and 11% in the case of Mexico for cement. There's also heterogeneity, and Brazil appears with the biggest losses, 1.5 of exports, and in the other extreme, Central America with 0.5%. Although we would like to have a more adequate model for the reduction of impacts, impacts are limited, and obviously, if we increase the price of carbon, the system is going to be different, and impacts are going to be bigger. But the source of concern is that more than the magnitude of the losses, that is the consequences of this kind of mechanism of the multilateral system of trade, which is so significant to all of us, because if that system vanishes, losses are going to be far from small. And on the other hand, environmental efficiency, I would like to see environmental efficiency connected with this kind of mechanism. There's no doubt there's a lot of controversy on the consistency of the BCA with the principle of discrimination by the WTO. There are people for and there are people against. But we have to recognize that the Europeans have made a significant effort to make their C-band the least discriminatory tool. I don't know how that implementation is going to be made. After reading the different documents on the topic, one possibility is to use the domestic intensity of European production in order to couple this with the tariff, the carbon tariff with imports, European imports. That wouldn't discriminate between countries and avoid complaints at the WTO. This is not only interesting, but it may reduce the calculation of the carbon tariff related to direct imports, regardless of inputs being international or domestic. What is the difficulty of calculating this? Well, this is related to methodology as well. We have to simplify as much as we can in order to reduce the problem of discrimination as much as possible. But we may be reducing the capacity of reducing emissions at the same time. The products covered by C-band those which are intensive in energy and exposed to trade, most of the emissions are indirect emissions. So if we include indirect emissions in CBAM, the impact of emissions is reduced. If you use the criteria of intensity in Europe, you will eliminate the incentive to exporters to reduce their emissions because they know they're going to pay according to the emissions produced by domestic producers. So there is a trade-off between this type of mechanism, the WTO regulations, and reducing emissions in the mechanism. Let me give another example. The Bank of France makes a simulation with CBAM, which is more rigorous. The CBAM, which would be necessary for Europe to comply with its obligations in terms of the contributions defined domestically. Although the system is more rigorous and the price, the carbon price is different, that would entail a period of practically 20 years of 0.26% in global emissions. If the motivation is to reduce emissions, we shouldn't be making so much noise, especially related to the rules of the multilateral system of trade.
De qualquer maneira, eu penso que, ou seja, se eu não tomo em conta tanto o comércio quanto os objetivos de manter as ganancias de comércio.
If you want to combat
el cambio climático,
climate change and keep your gains, CBAM is the most reasonable mechanism at hand because it would entail the least damages in terms of trade because of two reasons. One, when I see, for example, the proposals by the Climate Club, that would be to give a death certificate to the system because that would create a club of countries with a commission with a tariff, the magnitude of which has nothing to do with the content of carbon of the goods being exported. This is arbitrary and would entail demoralization of the system. I believe that the other choice is more acceptable and consistent with the system functioning and flowing. All the estimates show that if our countries have to comply with the obligations they have to take into account their NDCs, I think they would have to implement a carbon tax, and those which already have one, they will have to increase the value. So less than 10 tons per $10 per ton of carbon is one value to consider.
via algumas estimações del fundo, por exemplo, hablam
Some
de
estimates, for
imposto de carbono de
example,
$50. Não? Então, assim,
consider
eu não vejo
a
como
tax
evitar
amounted
que
to $50.
se adote, se cria mecanismo um imposto de carbono ou cap and trade, não? Isso
I don't know how to
implicar
avoid
os mesmos
either of these
problemas
two,
de
tax or cap and trade.
competitividade que têm os europeus, né? De alguma maneira isso vai
And
generar uma fuga de carbono
this
e
is
vai
going
generar
to
uma demanda
generate a
especificamente
carbon
ajustamento de
leakage in
ajuste
Europe
de
and a
fronteira
demand for a frontier
para
adjustment or a border
minimizar
adjustment to be
esse
applied
impacto,
in order
não?
to minimize that
Entonces,
kind of impact.
nosotros, dado el hecho de que los países están indo unilateralmente para intentar
And
resolver el
given the fact
problema,
that
vamos a tener que
countries are
enfrentar
working
esse tipo de dilema
unilaterally
e me
to face
parece
this
que esse
problem, I
seria o
think we will
mecanismo
have
mais
to
razonável
face
para
this
evitar
problem.
danos maiores
And the
ao
mechanism I
comércio, não?
just presented is
Lo
the
mismo
best
pasa con la
to
certificación de
avoid
deforestación. Yo creo que,
significant
o sea,
problems. The
no se puede
same
cuestionar la
applies
motivación
to
y el derecho de los países de
deforestation
imponer sus estándares
allowances.
ambientales, técnicos,
I
lo que
believe
sea,
that
¿no?
countries have
Ahora,
the right
obviamente,
to
hay siempre riesgos
apply
ahí,
their own
se llama
environmental
de
standards,
sustitución de políticas, ¿no? De policy
but
substitution, o sea,
the
de
problem of
usar eso como un
policy
mecanismo de
substitution
proteccionismo para
appears
favorecer
because it
a los
may
produtores
be
locales. Isso
a
existe para qualquer
protectionist
tipo
measure
de
to
estándar
protect
técnico
domestic
ou
producers
fitossanitário, não?
in terms
Pero
of
me parece que mais que,
phytosanitary measures, for example.
teria mais sentido, em lugar de tentar questionar esse tipo
But
de
instead of
standard, não? Me parece que
questioning
haria
this type of
mais
standard,
sentido, ou seja, concentrar os esforços em
I
uma
think it would be more
metodologia, não?
sensible
Mas
to
concentrar mais os
focus on
esforços em esforço de,
methodology.
se não harmonização, que me parece que é um objetivo inatingível, pero
Harmonization cannot be
esforço de
achieved from my point
reconhecimento
of view, but at
mútuo
least
dessas
we should aim
certificações e
at
estándares, não? Ou seja,
certification of standards.
permitir que os países não necessariamente adotem os mesmos estándares seja
This doesn't mean
deforestação
that
ou
countries
seja
are going
de
to
conteúdo
adopt
de
the
carbono, mas
same
pelo menos que
standards in terms of deforestation
entrem
or
na
carbon
negociação que
content,
permitam que eles
but
reconozcam os
I
estándares de
mean
cada
a
dentro da
negotiation in
de
which
certos
countries
parâmetros, não?
know
Isso me
the
parece que seria
standards of
super
the other
importante, não
parties
só por el
within
tema
certain
de redução do
parameters.
risco aí de captura, né, por interesses protecionistas, sino também porque aí uma quantidade
You know
importante de
that there are
renda que vai
protectionist
ser generada
interests,
por essas
and there's
certificações, não?
a lot of income which is
Não
going
sei
to
no
be
Lula
generated thanks to this kind of
se hace las
certifications.
certificaciones, que vende las certificaciones va a generar una cantidad de renta importante que
Because
interesa a nuestros países que parte que
upon the
nosotros nos apropiemos
certification,
de parte
there are
dessa
going to
renda
be
também, não? Ou seja,
income, and
que
I
nos
believe we have
asseguremos
the right
que o
to
custo desse tipo de certificação não
appropriate
seja
part of that
proibitivo, sobretudo
income.
para
So costs
los
don't have to be prohibitive,
pequeños e medianos
especially for small
exportadores, não?
and
Nesse
medium-sized
sentido,
exporters.
ou seja, para lograr algo desse estilo, ou seja, reconhecimento
In sum,
mútuo de certificações de carbono de deforestação, me parece que
to
os
go
TLCs,
forward
os acordos
instead
de
of
livre comércio, seriam
DFPs and BCAs,
o instrumento ideal para
regional
se
trade
negociar esse
agreements
tipo
is
de harmonização e de reconhecimento mútuo,
the
não?
element to reach this
Idealmente
kind of
seria multilateral,
harmonization.
algo
Ideally, it
na
would
linha do
be
livre tratado de
multilateral,
livre, por exemplo,
for
não?
example, ISO
Pero
14000.
se isso não é possível,
But
se pelo menos se use a rede de acordos que temos,
if that is
idealmente
not
se estamos falando
feasible,
do
we
Mercosul,
should make use
seria
of the
obviamente
network
instrumento
we have, for
ideal
example, at
para
Mercosur
fazer esse tipo
level,
de esforço em particular nas negociações atuais com a União
and
Europeia, não? Ou
in
seja,
particular,
por que
in the
não
current
incluir nas
negotiations with
negociações nesse
the
side letter
European
ou
Union,
do
we may
quer
include this
queiram
kind of
negociar,
negotiation
o
in a side
esforço de
letter
permitir, né, que haja reconhecimento mútuo em
in order
termos
to
de
have
certificados de
mutual
deforestação
agreement in terms of
seja em termos
deforestation
de conteúdo
certification
de carbono. Não? Brasil, por exemplo,
and
tem uma
content
experiência
of carbon.
muito exitosa, muito interessante
Brazil
com
has a successful
laboratório
experience
do
with
soja, não?
the
Uma
soy
iniciativa privada que
moratorium.
inclui standards, inclui mecanismo
It is a
claro para evitar
private
redução
initiative,
de soja
but it
em áreas
includes
que foram deflorestadas.
standards.
Por que não, usar esse tipo de experiência e
It
negociar com os europeus
is
de uma
related to
maneira
the
a evitar
areas
que
which have
se
been deforested. And
simplesmente
we
uma
can
decisão
make
unilateral por parte da União
use
Europeia
of that
para
kind of
definir o
experiences
que
when
é
we have to
produto
negotiate with the European
livre
Union
de deforestação
in order to
e
define what
um produto que não
DFP
tenha muito
is,
intensidade de carbono. Não? E
or
por
to
fim, e
define
termino
a
aqui,
product
só
which is
comentário sobre o tema
not
que comentou
so
Mariana
high intensive
com
in
relação ao tema
carbon.
da fuga de carbono. Não?
Now,
A
what
mim
about leakage?
lo veo complicado essa ideia de que basta mirar el hecho de que las emisiones en los países desarrollados se
Emissions in
estabilizó,
developed
empezó a
countries
bajar
was
y en los
stabilized,
países
even started to
en
decline,
desarrollo están,
and
siguen subindo. Eso
in
sería
developing
una
countries they
evidencia
continue
clara de
to
fuga de carbono o de
increase. That is a clear
pollution havens, no,
uh,
paraísos de
demonstration
poluição.
or
Não?
an
Estou,
example of
estou
carbon
seguro que já
leakage.
discutiram em outras
I'm sure
apresentações aqui em curso essa
this
ideia
is
de
going to
que
be
o
discussed in
comércio
other
impacta
presentations. I mean, the idea that
as emissões de
trade
carbono ou de outros poluentes
impacts
via
on
efeito
emissions, whether carbon
escala,
emissions
né?
or other
Porque tem um impacto
pollutants,
sobre o crescimento, efeito
and it creates an
tecnologia, que
impact
tecnologia
on growth
afeta, né?
and technology.
Tipo de tecnologia para produzir bens, etc., tecnologias
And I
mais limpas
mean
ou sujas, e ele é feito
cleaner
composicional, ou
or
seja, como
dirtier
cambia
technologies,
a
and the
proporção dos
composition,
setores, entre setores mais
how
limpos
sectors
etc. Não?
composition is
Então,
changed
se eu não
and
tomo esse tipo
classified in
de
cleaner
framework, não,
or
e
not
vir a
so
data,
clean
não,
sectors.
existem
If you
aí
take this
vários
framework and you analyze
registros
data,
desse tipo em que descompõem
you can
né,
see a
las
breakdown
emissões dos países desarrollados em los últimos, não sei,
of
50 anos,
emissions
não?
in
E o
developed countries
efeito
over
que
the last
predomina
50 years. And
para
the
os países
dominant
desarrollados, não? O que
factor
explica o
here
comportamento das
and
emissões dessa
what
estabilização
justifies
daqueles
the
projetos
emission
daquela,
behavior
não é o efeito
is
composição,
not
e
the
seria o efeito
composition,
consistente
but
com a ideia de que há
an
uma
effect
fuga de
that is
carbono, há
consistent with the idea that
o
there's
efeito
carbon
impacto
leakages or this haven,
poluição seria
a
muito.
pollution
Não, pelo
haven
contrário, não? Ou seja,
effect.
generar esse
It's
efeito
the
de
opposite.
composição, né?
The
De
composition
especialização é
effect,
muito pequeno
specialization
em uma
effect,
mira
is very
de
small
tecnologia, não? O que domina, o que
vis-a-vis
explica
the
o hecho de que
technology.
eles
What
lograram
explains the fact
estabilizar e
that they
reduzir sus
managed to
emissões
stabilize
é o
and
hecho de que
reduce their
adotaram
emissions
tecnologias
is
mais
because they
limpas,
adopted
seja por
cleaner
um impacto de
technologies,
comércio, seja por um impacto
whether to
relativo
impact
a las
trade
regulações que adotaram, não? E
or
lo mismo
the
pasa quando uno
regulations that
mira
they
el lado
embraced.
de los
And the
países en
same happens
desarrollo,
when
¿no?
you analyze
Si
developing
la fuga de
countries.
carbono fuera realmente un
If carbon
componente importante, lo que
leakage
uno
were
vería en la
significant,
descomposición
what
de la
you
emisión,
would
de las
see
emisiones en estos
in
países sería un
breaking down
efecto
the emissions
composición
would be
dominante, ¿no? O sea,
a
que
dominant
reflejaría
composition effect,
estos países,
reflecting the
nuestros
fact
países,
that
estaríamos nos
our
especializando
countries
em bienes mais sucios ou mais
would be
poluentes. E não é
specializing
por lo
in
que
more
passa, não?
pollutant
Lo que
goods. And that
vê,
is not the
eu não vejo lo
situation
que
right now.
domina em nossos
I
países
don't
em o efeito
see
escala, não?
I see
Simplesmente
that
porque
the
os países
scale is not
cresceram,
dominant because
ou seja, não há
countries
como evitar
grew
com o crescimento
and
generar
you
mais
can't
emissões. Por esse tipo de
avoid
especialização é em
growth
geral
and
pequeno
offset emissions.
e não há señal muito consistente. Ou seja, há
So there's
países
no
que têm
consistency here.
efeito composição,
Countries
digamos, positivo, ou seja,
having a positive
se especializam
composition,
bienes mais limpos,
specializing
e há
in cleaner
países que se
goods,
especializam em
and some
bienes
other
mais
countries
sujos. Não?
specialize
Me quedo por
in
aqui. Gracias.
uh, products or
Muchas
goods that are
gracias,
not so
Mauricio,
clean.
por los
Thank you,
comentarios.
Mauricio, for your
Tenemos un par
comments.
de preguntas.
We have some
Me
questions.
gustaría invitar a Daniela Matos, de
I'd
la
like
Secretaría de Comercio Exterior de
Daniela
Brasil,
Matos from
a
the
abrir su
Secretariat of
micrófono
Trade in Brazil to
para
open
comentar y luego el embajador
her
Enrique
mic to
Ferrer
make a
Vieira.
comment, and then Ambassador
Daniela.
Enrique Ferrer Vieira. Daniela, you have the floor.
Ok.
I'm going to speak in Portuguese. I know we have interpreters. Mariana, your presentation was excellent. I have two questions about it. Regarding goods that were considered with a broader objective in this scenario, can you hear me?
Perfecto.
A broader scenario, I would like to know what were the additional goods? You mentioned European carbon leakage schedule. Mariana, can you share that schedule or list with us? And the second one is about Brazil's emissions and many other countries' emissions regarding, in contrast with the EU emissions. How did you get that data? Are you considering direct and indirect emissions or only the direct ones? Because I think this was an interesting topic. I mean, my attention was drawn to this topic.
Mariana, adelante.
¿Puedo contestar también al
I can
comentarista? Porque
answer.
juntamos todo, ¿o?
I can answer
Entonces,
to the commentator as well, so
ok,
we
entonces
can
el embajador
unify
Ferrer Vieira
answers.
también
So
tiene una pregunta.
Ambassador Ferrer Vieira also has a question.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you
buenas tardes a todos.
so much.
Y bueno, muy agradecido por las presentaciones.
I thank Mariana for her presentation, and particularly the study conducted by her and her team. The graphs are very interesting. I was trying to focus in Argentina. I am from Argentina. I saw from our total exports and in relation to EU regulations, deforestation-free regulations, these would affect 4% of Argentinian total exports to the world. By sector, in case of coffee, and also in Peru, the percentage would be higher in the sector or sector-wide. My question is towards exports towards the EU. Each country's export to EU, which percentage from those exports to Europe would be affected by implementing the DFP? In the Argentina Foreign Office, we conducted an analysis, and I think, and we arrived at conclusions that there's significant exports to be affected. In the case of Brazil, we have 34% Brazilian export to the EU will be affected. Ours would be a similar percentage, but I want to know if you actually do have some concrete data or a number, a definitive number about it. And we have a third question, Marcio Gabardo. You have the floor.
Buenos días a todos. Primeramente, gostaria de agradecer as apresentações.
I want to thank for the presentations. And the question to Mariana. Is there any study showing the per capita percentage and the per capita use of carbon in different countries? You showed a country with consumption and per capita production. No, not per capita. I'm sorry, the total production. I'm correcting myself. I mean, I go again. Is there any study when this data is compared to the total population of the country in order to have a clear snapshot in relation to who has higher emissions? Thank you very much for all your comments.
por los comentarios del comentarista.
Now I'm going to touch upon Mauricio's comments. I agree with most of what he said. I'm going to summarize that in 6 points. One, it's true that initially, and I mean emissions have scope 1, 2, and 3. 3 is the full product life cycle. 1 is just direct emissions, and 2 include the energy generation used in the product. So, as the carbon price increases in the EU, and there's a wider scope of emission, and that is included in the rule. So far, it's just scope 1, but over time, they can get to scope 3. And if more goods are included, this measure is going to become more important, and undoubtedly it will be. Second point is, what are you comparing against? And the application. And having read the rule, and I did not speak with any European expert about it, but this is my own thought. If you do not know the carbon content, I mean, if I want to export to the EU and I don't know the carbon content, then am I considered to be the worst 10% of EU producers? And that is taken as a benchmark. But also, I agree with Mauricio that many details are missing in the regulation. That's why there's a trial period, a transition period, where producers need to record data but not make any payment at all. Payments will become effective in 2026. From now on to 2026, they are going to fine-tune all implementation details. So each country has to pay attention to this detail, because based on how it is defined, that is going to determine your level of acceptance. Regarding the WTO, in both regulations, there are questions and answers sections, and there you can find a lot of detail. And they say that it's in line with the WTO. I am not an expert in those matters, but I know that in order to not to go against WTO rules, the countries can create trade regulations, trade limits that are related to the environmental issues, as long as they meet two criteria. One of them is treating foreign companies as domestic companies. And the second one is that foreign companies are treated on an equal footing, regardless the country where they come from. And the CBAM plays a role here. By the definition, it tries to level the playing field, but deforestation-free is not so clear in this respect, because it's going to have additional requirements for different countries based on its deforestation rate. If your deforestation rate is low, they are going to have different requirements vis-a-vis a country with high deforestation rates. So I don't think they are treating all countries on an equal footing. So again, I am not an expert here, but I cannot say more than that. And the ideal scenario wouldn't be unilateral actions. So the optimal scenario is considering that the global issue should be dealt with unilaterally. We know as economists, the theory. When there are so many parties involved, it's really hard to get to an agreement through negotiations. If you have attended the COPs, you know that there are 200 countries, 50,000 consultants, and it's very difficult to reach an agreement. That's why the system is fragmented and complicated. And along the same lines, I'm not sure that the carbon price is going to do better than the quantitative limits in relation to the carbon, the ETS. What's the likelihood of countries agreeing on a carbon pricing? Zero, because the carbon prices are different from $3 to $180. So converging on a single carbon price is really difficult. Then regarding the methodology efforts, I really do agree that the more we focus on carbon certification methodologies and deforestation-free, the better. And now, if they can be included in the EU-Mercosur side letter, I'm really not so sure about that. And finally, regarding Mauricio, I agree that this will be better implemented in a general equilibrium model. We did this in the World Bank. The World Bank is drafting some reports called reports on climate and development in each country. What did we do here? We developed some Excel file to have an initial view of the impact in all countries that we were reporting against within Latin America and the Caribbean. In order to be more realistic, we need to create an equilibrium model, a general equilibrium model to be more realistic. There are things about it in CBAM, in the documents, but not as much regarding deforestation free because it's a newer mechanism. Regarding Daniela's question, the list or schedule of all the goods included is an annex to our document. So you will be able to see it there with the codes exactly as they are, the harmonized system codes. We wanted to create this annex in order to be replicated and some others can use it. From the moment we created the document and the European Union launched the final regulation, there might be some codes that changed and some codes that were included at a later stage. So you need to check that. And the results I showed were scope 1 results. In our database, we have scope 1 and 2, and if you are interested in a specific result, you can send me an email and I can provide you with that information. We also have the percentage of EU exports. In a previous study in 2018 for the IDB, we were looking at the two metrics, the percentage of total exports and percentage of EU exports. I didn't show you this information, but we do have the data. But these percentages have increased for the countries in the region, actually. So regarding your per capita question, it's not the same thing. We have per capita emission statistics, and of course, we don't see the same picture here because the per capita emissions are indicators with numerators. The more inhabitants, the lower the indicator or metric, and that's the reason why it's difficult to agree, because it would be easier to say, what should countries do? Nothing about pledge and review, or to determine each country's contribution. All of us can have the same per capita emissions. Chile would be very happy because they have such a high population. Their per capita indicator is very low. But Australia, that has whose population is small, wouldn't be wouldn't take advantage of this. So looking at emissions and accumulated over time and per capita emissions and emissions per GDP and the different findings from these indicators make it difficult to agree on a single indicator. The data is there, but many countries would be against a single unified per capita emissions, depending on each country's situation. And that's why it's difficult. But this doesn't mean that everything is lost, because the Kyoto protocols, you might think that it was good for nothing because United States did not adhere to it, but the emissions were not reduced by 5.2%. They were reduced by 4%, and that is not so bad. And I'm speaking about the countries who pledged to that. So I think we need to continue working on this and fighting, because climate events lately make us think that it is mandatory, it is really necessary to reduce emissions, I mean. So we need to explore other alternatives to agree and continue fighting against climate change. Thank you, Mariana. Mauricio, do you have any final reflection?
Grazie, Veronica. No, mira, muy de acuerdo con que ha dicho
Mariana. No, I totally agree with Mariana.
Esse tema en el caso de los certificados de deforestación, me parece
when she referred to the market of deforestation, that question of classifying the countries in terms of risk is, to the best of my knowledge, a violation of the principle of non-discrimination by the WTO. It could be treated preferentially. That is to say, a common standard in the free trade agreements, which is consistent with the whole system. Thank you.
Mariana, por último,
Thank you, Mauricio.
si podrías compartir el informe del Banco Mundial sobre las condiciones
The
climáticas ambientales
attendees
por
are
país,
asking about the report
si podrías compartirlo
of
en el chat, quizás
environmental
lo ven
conditions
y
by
también
country
envíenlo tu
by the
contacto
World
en
Bank.
Uruguay para comunicarse
And
contigo.
perhaps you can give us the data on the chat.
Estás muteada.
Sí, los informes país sobre
The
clima y
reports
desarrollo no están
on
para todos los países.
climate and
Hasta ahora
development are
fue
not,
publicado están online,
they are online, but
se llaman CCDR,
CCDR,
Climate,
Country
Report.
and Development
Y
Report.
esos informes están publicados hasta ahora en Latinoamérica.
They have been
para Perú,
published in Latin America,
Argentina,
for
ahora está por
Peru,
salir
Argentina
Paraguay,
now,
va a salir el de
one about
Colombia,
to be
Ecuador,
launched, Paraguay, Colombia,
y de a poco van a
Ecuador.
ir saliendo todos. Los dos primeros son Argentina y
The
Perú.
first two are
Los pueden
Argentina
encontrar
and
online
Peru,
porque
and you
ya
can
son
find them
públicos.
online because they
De
are
hecho,
public
ayer
there.
presentamos en el Senado de
Yesterday, we
Argentina,
presented
Congreso, porque también había
we
diputados,
presented
el
at
informe
the
del
Argentine
país de
Senate
Argentina, el
the
CCDR de
the
Argentina.
CCDR for Argentina.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much.
Les agradezco a todos su presencia. Esto fue todo por hoy.